What is up, my fellow Shield Brothers? It's the Shield Brother here with the History of Mada with another A Day in the Life. Today's A Day in the Life, we're talking about the armament and the weaponry and fighting style of Napoleon's France during the Napoleonic Wars and the First French Empire. So, Napoleon's powerhouse. The French Revolution and subsequent Napoleonic Wars revolutionized the military strategy used by the European powers. The impact of this period was still to be felt in the American Civil War and the early phases of World War I. With the advent of cheap small arms and the rise of the drafted citizen soldier, army sizes increased rapidly to become mass forces. This necessitated dividing the army first into divisions and later into corps. Along with divisions came divisional artillery, lightweight mobile cannons with great range and firepower that would greatly revolutionize how they were used. Napoleon invariably sought to achieve decision in battle with the sole aim of utterly destroying his opponent, usually achieving success through superior maneuvers and artillery barrages. As ruler and general, he dealt with the grand strategy, as well as the operational strategy, making use of political and economic measures as well. So you could just see how he had all these different gears and all these different changes that he used together in his powerhouse of France. While not the originator of the methods he used, Napoleon was very effective combined with the relatively superior maneuver and battle strategies and stages into one event. Before this, general officers had considered this approach to battle as separate events. However, Napoleon used the maneuver to battle to dictate how and where the battle would progress, combining this into one part of the battle. The Battle of Austerlitz was a perfect example of this maneuver. Napoleon withdrew from a strong position to draw his opponent forward and tempt him into a flank attack, weakening his center. This allowed the French army to split into allied armies and gain the victory. And you can see how, due to his different uses of tactics, as well as the economic and other factors of his infrastructure, he was able to make a powerhouse out of the weakened France. Napoleon used two primary strategies for the approach to battle in his different tactics. His maneuver de doré, or the move to the rear, was intended to place the French army across the enemy's lines of communications, and using a pinning force to keep the opponent stationary. He would swing around onto his opponent's rear with a bulk of his army, forcing the adversary to either accept a battle on Napoleon's terms or push further into the pinning force and hostile territory. By placing his army into the rear, his opponent's supplies and communications would be cut. This had a negative effect on enemy morale. Once joined, the battle would be one in which his opponent could not afford to accept defeat. So this also allowed Napoleon to select multiple march routes into a battle site. Initially, the lack of force concentration helped with foraging for food and sought to confuse the enemy as to his real location and intentions. This strategy, along with the use of forced marches, created a morale bonus that heavily played into his favor with his tactics. There was also the indirect approach in battle, also used by Napoleon to disrupt the linear formations used by the Allied armies. As the battle progressed, the enemy committed their reserves to stabilize the situation, and Napoleon would suddenly release the flanking formation to attack the enemy. His opponents, being suddenly confronted with a new threat and new barrage, and with little reserves left, had no choice but to weaken the area closest to the flanking formation and draw up a battle line at a right angle in an attempt to stop the oncoming threat. Once this had occurred, Napoleon would mass his reserves at the hinge of the right angle and launch a heavy attack to break the lines. The rupture in the enemy lines allowed the Napoleon's cavalry to flank both lines and roll them up, leaving his opponent no choice but to surrender or flee. The second strategy, which is this strategy, used by Napoleon when confronted with two or more enemies, was the use of his central position. This allowed Napoleon to drive a wedge to separate the armies as long as swing around, like I stated earlier, and you can see how his logistics and his tactics were very bold, and they were very revolutionary in the way they were used for this time period. So due to this, as well as his well-trained troops and his determination and morale, and just his charisma with the people of France, he was able to kind of steamroll. And it's very impressive what he could do, because it's one thing to conquer and create colonial powers for these European powers, but it's another thing entirely to be a European power and take on another full-pledged European power and defeat them, let alone 3 or 4 at a time. And he was just marching through Europe and changing the way that Europe as a map and as a social climate he was completely remapping everything, but also he revolutionized how wars would be fought for the rest of history due to his tactics and his maneuvers and just his revolutionary ideas and usage of the different factors of battle. One of them being Napoleon's largest advantage, which was the speed of his movement of his troops. Napoleon insisted on extreme speed when conducting the marches, movements, and attacks of his enemy. He claimed that the loss of time is irreparable in war. I may lose a battle, but I should never lose a minute, he would say. Many factors contributed to Napoleon's ability to perform these flexible maneuvers and movements. From the division of his army into an independent corps system, to the avoidance of slow-moving, lengthy supply lines, instead, Napoleon's army looked to live off the land, acquiring the motto, "The war must feed the war." Napoleon sought to acquire food from his surrounding environment. Whether that meant paying friendly countries or simply foraging, these factors combined with Napoleon's innate persuasive ability to inspire his troops and his charisma resulted in successive victories in dominating fashion. His opponents were often confused and unsettled as Napoleon intricately coordinated strategic attacks on profound scales for this time period. It was just mind-blowing what this man was able to accomplish against other very strong European powers. So that brings us to the weapons of war. What was actually used by Napoleon's France and his soldiers? Well, first off, there will be the infantry, which foot soldiers had several basic tools and weapons with which to try to kill the enemy. Swords, bayonets, pistols, and other hand-to-hand, as well as firearms, which starts with the musket. The muzzle-loading smoothbore muskets were the main weapon of foot soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars. They were slow to load, and trained infantry were happy to fire off they were able and very happy to fire off 3 volleys in a minute. That was kind of the norm, and woefully inaccurate, however. A marksman may hope to hit a man at 80 paces, but at 100 paces, the odds became increasingly and exceedingly small to hit the man that you were targeting. That's why we had things such as line fire and ranks. But then, after that, there's also rifles. A major improvement on the muskets when it came to accuracy was the rifle barrels of rifles spun. It was spinning the ball, and so that it kept its accuracy over far greater distances. At 200 paces, a rifle shot fired by a trained man would kill the target, almost 3 times the range of a musket. However, the rifles took longer to load, and there was far fewer of them able to be made, which is a fact that put Napoleon Bonaparte off from using them. He used far fewer rifles compared to people such as the Prussians and the English, whereas he favored the musket and the amount of fire able to be committed by it. That brings us to the bayonets. The bayonets was use of cold steel, in the bayonet charge is more of a legend than fact because of, the devastating effect, especially morale, and the morale effect it had, because, you see a wall of glistening steel coming at you, it's gonna break a man. But it's got a lower percentage of casualties during the Napoleonic Wars than other effects. And it was this dagger-like attachment on the soldier's musket, and I've had a video about this a while back about the bayonet and its evolution. But the bayonet, however, was an extremely efficient terror weapon, I was stating, breaking the enemy's morale, as few troops would stand against a fearsome charge from this. The thought of being stabbed in the stomach or the ribs with one would have all of the bravest seeking some kind of escape, whether it be to charge back, fire, or fall back. That also brings us to the swords. Usually the weapon of only officers and non-commissioned officers, swords varied greatly in style from nation to nation and how they were used and from unit to unit. British infantry swords were generally straight blades, but light infantry officers wore the curved 1796 pattern that light cavalry sabers had the curve to it. So there was also the pikes, but the pikes were only the property of sergeants, and the pike was a 9-foot spear that had a foot-long blade screwed into the pole, and the spearhead had a 6-inch crossbar to stop the point from driving too far into the enemy. Although it was not used very widely, and when it was only used by sergeants to kind of distinguish them from the common man. And there was also the pistols. Many officers carried pistols during the Napoleonic Wars, but they were not as widespread in action as they became in later conflicts. After the Napoleonic Wars is when more and more officers started to use pistols as well as other troops. But in the Napoleonic Wars, it was not very widespread used. That brings us to the cavalry. The cavalry was the main weapon of the flanking maneuvers, and there was two main types. There was the sabers and there was the lancers. The main weapon for the cavalrymen of this time period was the sword, of which there were many types and patterns and curves. In addition to the sabers, there was Napoleonic horsemen who armed themselves with firepower carbines and pistols. But also, there was the deadly lancers, and you can kind of see all three of them here in the screen here. There's the picture depicting all three types. The carabiners, the swordsmen with the sabers, and the lancers. And then that brings us to one of the most deadly armaments of the Napoleonic era, especially used by Napoleon, the artillery. The most effective killer of men in the Napoleonic battlefield was artillery, and it came in a variety of forms. Most were effective at long range and murderous in close range. As one would expect with the Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte being a former artillery officer himself, France's cannons made up the backbone of his ground forces and the support. The French guns were generally used in massed batteries to soften up enemy formations before being subjugated to the close attention of the infantry and cavalry. Superb gun training and gun crews allowed Bonaparte to move the weapons at great speed and accuracy to either bolster a weakening defensive position or hammer a potential break in the enemy lines. In general, French guns were 4-pounders, 8-pounders, and 12-pounders, with the lighter calibers being phased out and replaced by 6-pounders later in the wars. So you would have the standard of the 6-pounder, the 8-pounder, and the 12-pounder being used in the battlefield and in the war. French cannons had brass barrels, and their carriages, wheels, and limbers were painted olive green, and you'll see that in this painting here on the screen. You can see the olive green carriage and wheels of the French artillery detachment. So when combined, you get that powerhouse I was talking about with the combination of the revolutionary tactics, the good use of firearms and morale, the cavalry with the three types of weaponry used, and then the deadly artillery. So when you put those together with Napoleon's wit and the good generals that he had and good commanders that he had backing him, you get the powerhouse that was Napoleon's France and the First French Empire during the Napoleonic Wars. And you can see how he was able to fight off the other European powers due to the usage and combination of these armaments and soldiers. Which brings to the effectiveness. Many people ask, well, was he actually an effective commander? And my answer is yes. In my opinion, the First French Empire under Napoleon was one of the greatest empires of all time. Not due to them having a large expanse, because that, yes, the British did have a huge empire where the sun never set on the British Empire. However, it's one thing to beat a native populace due to superior technology and weaponry than it is to beat a full-fledged European power in their home front. So you can see how effective Napoleon Bonaparte was in leading his men in combat. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Shield Brother with another A Day in the Life. I hope you learned something about Napoleon's France and how effective his army was and the armament of the French. And if you have a question, a comment, or suggestion, you can leave that down below for me in the comment section. If you like this kind of content, leave me a like. If you don't, go ahead and leave me a dislike. And always remember to hit that subscribe and that bell button. And as always, I'll catch y'all next time.